What's up guys, welcome back and welcome to my new home. Me and my wife just bought our first home and we're super excited, but honestly the kitchen leaves a bit to be desired. So we might start a little bit of a home improvement series, and today we're going to start by building some cabinets and putting them on that wall. Alright, so we're back here at my dad's shop and we're ready to get started. And just a disclaimer, I am totally a beginner. I've never built cabinets before, so hopefully this will help other beginners get started in something like this as we figure it out. But we've got some plywood that we picked up earlier, and I think I'm going to start breaking it down with the track saw here, because breaking down giant pieces of plywood by yourself or even with help on the table saw can be very tricky. So let's get it set up. Oh, and before we get into that, here's the plans I drew out for it. It's always nice to have reference for the dimensions that you decided on, and it's also good to figure out the materials you'll need and the cut list. So, as I mentioned, I decided to use the track saw for breaking down the plywood for the box. The setup takes a bit longer, but with some care you can be accurate. And if you wanted, you could also cut your pieces about an 1/8 inch wider than you needed, and then run everything through the table saw to get them all exactly the same. Anyway, I ended up making 2 cuts down the length of the plywood at 12 inches, and then cross-cut those to size for the top, bottom, and sides. I chose the track saw for the crosscuts as well because our chop saw doesn't extend past like 8 or 10 inches, so that's a bummer. This little tapered countersink drill bit was pretty nifty for drilling all the pilot holes for putting the box together. Then it was time to put in the center divider. We messed this up the first time, as you'll see later. We measured to the center on both the top and the bottom, and should have just lined up the center divider with those lines. Somehow we messed up using the square and things ended up not square, so that was weird. I don't know what we did wrong, but probably best to just use accurate marks for lining everything up. Also, never a bad idea to mark the front and back and bottom and top and everything else for your box. And this is just us cutting out the back of the box. We used 3/4 inch plywood, but if I were to go back, I would have just used 1/2 inch. When we flipped the box over to put the back on, we noticed the center divider was protruding past the top a bit. So, got out the sander and started sanding it down. And of course, went a little bit too far.
You're like an inch too short over here. Just kidding.
Jokes aside, we lined up the back and then put a whole bunch of screws in it.
Oh shoot.
Stop that.
There's like a little bit of a bow there. But
Gap
yeah.
Sanded in. And this is where we discovered our skills with the humble square. Or rather, the lack thereof. It was just a matter of unscrewing the top, drilling new holes, and lining it up for reals. And once it was done, we even had Papa's approval.
What's better, square-wise?
Yeah. Then we started ripping some material for the trim pieces on the end of each box. The wood was not that straight, but I thought I could manhandle it into place at least long enough to nail it in. And I realized too late that I didn't include the thickness of the trim into my calculations, which would have made my box 1.5 inches wider than expected. Also, in retrospect, 3/4 inch trim is way too wide anyway, but that's beside the point, because I ended up just using these pieces to build a practice door. And good thing I did too, because I messed up the math pretty bad. It's always good to have a practice piece before diving in on the more expensive material. Anyway, then I built another practice door frame out of plywood, and that ended up fitting much better. And I was actually planning on using plywood for all the doors at this point, and just filling in the edges and all that stuff. But it turned out that my dad was remodeling something in his house, and had all this leftover cherry he was willing to let me use. So we did a little extra work removing nails and planing off glue and all that stuff, and built the doors out of that. stop blocks are definitely your friend when making repeated cuts. This was my jerry-rigged way of using a stop block. There we go. And this is just one final triple check that the door fit with the correct gap. It was good, so I made 3 more. And here's another reason why having a practice piece is good if you don't know what you're doing. I wanted a rounded over edge on the door frames, and it's easy to go too far with the router if you're doing this stuff by hand. And of course a router table would have made this much easier, but I don't have one. So I just had to watch the bearing very carefully to make sure I didn't go too far. Then came the very tedious task of clamping down a frame piece, routing the edge a bit, moving the clamps throughout the rest, and repeating until I had them all rounded over. Once that was done, it was time to put the rabbet on the back side to fit the inside filler plywood piece thing. I experimented on my practice frame to get the right depth, and once I got it, I put that rabbet on all the other pieces. Once all the frame pieces had been rounded over and rabbeted, it was time for cleanup, which I did by hand and was so much fun. But it wasn't nearly as fun as the glue up. I don't really have a great way to glue up 45-degree frames, so it's pretty finicky and involved a lot of adjusting, tightening one clamp, loosening another, then tightening the first again, and back and forth, until it looked pretty decent. Once all the doors were glued up, it was time for that middle filler piece thing. I took some measurements and cut them out of 1/2-inch plywood, and of course they didn't fit perfectly, so that took some manual adjustments as well. I got it eventually and then glued them in. I used the smallest amount of glue I felt comfortable with because I did not want to deal with squeeze out on the front face. And again, didn't have a great way to clamp these, so found whatever heavy things we could around the shop and just stacked it up. As you can see, the corners were not perfectly aligned, so a bit of sanding took care of that. And then it was time for filling. I chose to use Bondo for this. I filled any chip or hole or gap I could find on the door frame's front and back. And I don't show it, but I also used Bondo to fill the plywood edges on the front face of the box. It turned out pretty well for that. You can't really tell that there's plywood there. It honestly probably just would have been easier to use some paintable iron-on edging though. And after sanding it all down, I added a small chamfer around the doors. Then it was time to add trim to the sides of the box. After realizing I couldn't use the 1x pine that I had planned on, I was just gonna fill the screw holes. But these 1/4-inch plywood pieces were left over from my dad's remodel as well, so I figured I could use these and make the box look a bit nicer. Oh, and one of the edges of the box wasn't perfectly aligned with the back, so I lined up the track saw and somehow got it perfectly flush. And after driving a few nails into some screws, the only tip I have for attaching trim like this is to mark out the location of the screws on the side where I could see. Then the trim pieces got sanded and filled and sanded again, and it was time to attach some hardware to the doors. This hinge hole drilling jig was very useful for this. One of these center finding drill bits would also be nice, and of course you have to know what kind of overlay you need in your hinges. I needed full overlay for the outside doors and half overlay for the inside doors that would be mounted on the same center divider. And of course the instructions included with the hardware are going to be very handy as well. Like I said, this jig was very nice. It has adjustable stops depending on the distance you need to drill away from the edge, and it has a little ruler built in so you can line everything up. It also has these 2 guide holes, which I assume work for most hinges, but it didn't work for mine. So I had to find another way to line those up. Which, if the hinge has a square back, you can use a square to line it up in the hole, or if not, you can use a ruler or something to measure out where the holes will be. I had 2 pairs of each because I went with the cheapest options I could find. For drilling the holes in the box itself, I just used a ruler to make a vertical line where they should go and held up the door for reference. I recommend just drilling 1 hole for each hinge, just in case you get it wrong. That way you have fewer superfluous holes in your box. Ask me how I know. And with some trial and error and adjusting of the hinges, I think I got the doors on pretty nicely. Each hinge is adjustable in multiple ways, so you have a small margin of error when hanging them. Then it was time to drill the holes for the shelf pins, and once again another jig came in quite useful. You don't need to put holes all the way up to the top or to the bottom, so I used a piece of scrap wood to start out, and then just moved the jig up the same number of times. Anyway, it was pretty straightforward. And then it was time to cut the wood for the shelves. I cut them about 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch, I don't really remember, shallower than the depth of the cabinet, and then the front edges got filled and painted. And finally, it looked like things were all coming together. So it was time to spray all the interior surfaces with a lacquer. Just had to lay down a thin first coat, sand it down, and then put on a heavier second coat. The lacquer dries in like 15 minutes, so it was ideal for something like this. I got some runs in my first attempt, but luckily we were able to sand that out and get a better result in the end. It's pretty workable stuff. Then I thought it'd be a good idea to caulk the edges I couldn't get to with Bondo. I had no idea what I was doing to start out and thought I could just rub it down with my finger, right? Well, it quickly became apparent that that was not the case. So I watched some YouTube and figured out that you use a razor to push it in the gap and scrape away most of the excess, and then use a wet cloth to wipe away everything except what's in the gap. Thank goodness for YouTube tutorials, right? And then it was finally paint time. I tried to get away with not masking the inside and just being real careful around the edges. And I was careful, but I definitely had to spend some time cleaning up. It would have been better to just mask. But anyway, other than that, the painting process was pretty straightforward. And I would say that in the meantime we were painting our existing kitchen, but really this was like a month after we moved in, and we had painted before we moved in, so yeah. Oh, and I almost forgot to drill the holes for the door handles. My dad made this jig, which was pretty useful. I just had to use a couple shims to line it up for the center of my doors. I will also add here that since the doors were hung and adjusted before I painted, I had to remove everything for painting. And in order to keep things straight, I numbered each door and each hinge top and bottom. That way, they would all go back together in the same place and hopefully require minimal adjustment post-paint. I'm sure someone more skilled would only hang and adjust the doors after painting. And finally, the cabinet was done, and it was time to hang it up. I don't have a ton of advice here since I'm not a professional, but you're definitely going to want at least 1 or 2 other people to help you, and probably some good sturdy pieces of wood that would be the right height to support the cabinet off the countertop or the floor or whatever. We forgot this and ended up using a super sketch method of finding a cutting board that was about right and hoping for the best. Anyway, it worked out in the end. And as far as the basics go for hanging a cabinet, just gotta make sure you find the studs in the wall and put screws into those. I think we ended up putting about 9 screws in this cabinet. Anyway, it worked out. We figured it out. Thank goodness for my dad, because there were so many places I would have been lost in this whole process that he helped me out a lot. Thanks, Dad. Anyway, here's our updated kitchen. It's still pretty tiny, but the storage space is vastly improved. Definitely learned a lot in this build and had a pretty good time doing it. I hope you enjoyed. See you guys next time.